The letter hit the kitchen table like a gunshot. Evelyn Mercer hadn't even opened it yet, and her hands were already shaking. She recognized the return address: Hargrove and Associates Land Corporation, Billings, Montana. The same name that had been showing up in her nightmares for 6 weeks. She tore it open. You have 14 days to vacate the premises. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action and forced removal. The property at 4412 Copper Ridge Road is now the rightful asset of Hargrove Land Corporation, acquired through lawful debt collection on a loan bearing the signature of Thomas Allen Mercer, deceased. Thomas had never borrowed a single dollar against this land, not once in 31 years. Evelyn read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, on the floor, and stayed there for a long time. Outside, the wind was pushing hard against the walls of a house that was already losing the argument. If that were your home, your husband's name, your whole life on a piece of paper someone else wrote, what would you do? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. And when you get there, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Evelyn did next, you need to understand everything she had already survived. The morning Thomas Mercer died, the coffee was still hot. That was the detail that stayed with Evelyn longest. Not the paramedics, not the awful sound of the ambulance pulling away down the dirt road, not the silence that followed. It was the coffee. She had poured 2 cups out of habit, the way she had done every morning for 31 years, and by the time she understood what was happening in the bedroom, both cups had gone cold on the counter. She poured them both down the drain. She never made 2 cups again. That was 14 months ago. People in Harlan County, Montana had expected Evelyn Mercer to sell the ranch by autumn, not because they wished her ill, most of them liked her well enough, but because the math was obvious. 160 acres of rocky high country land, a farmhouse that needed a new roof, cattle that had dwindled to 22 head, and a woman in her early 60s who had never run the place alone. The neighboring ranchers had done the math quietly, the way people do when they're trying to be respectful about something they've already decided. The Mercer place would go. It was only a question of timing. Evelyn had done the math too. She'd just come to a different answer. She wasn't a woman who announced things. She didn't call a meeting or make a speech. She simply started doing the work. Every morning at 5:15 she was out the door, and every night she came back inside smelling like mud and livestock and her own sweat, and she ate whatever she'd managed to put together and went to sleep and did it again. The ranch wasn't thriving. She would never have claimed that. But it was breathing, and she intended to keep it that way. What she hadn't planned for was Hargrove. She'd heard the name for the first time in late October, when a man in a clean truck pulled into her driveway without calling ahead. He was wearing pressed clothes and holding a business card, and he introduced himself as a representative of Hargrove Land Corporation out of Billings. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they've already made up their minds and are only going through the motions of asking. He told her the company had significant interest in the Copper Ridge corridor, that they were prepared to offer her a fair price, more than fair, he said, using those exact words, more than fair, for the property and its remaining assets, that the market in that area wasn't going to get better, and that a woman in her situation might want to consider the security of a clean sale. Evelyn had listened to all of it standing on her porch with her arms crossed. Then she said, "I'm not selling." The man had smiled the way people smile when they think you don't understand the situation yet. He left his card on the porch railing. She let the wind take it. He came back 3 weeks later with a different number, higher. Evelyn said the same thing. He came back a 3rd time in December with a number that made her throat tighten, because it was real money, the kind of money that could actually change the shape of the rest of her life. And she still said no, and this time she said it before he'd finished his sentence because she was tired of the conversation. After that, the visit stopped. She'd thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The letters started in January. First they were inquiries, then they were offers, with deadlines attached. Then the tone shifted. Subtle at first, the way weather shifts before a real storm. Something in the language that felt less like a business letter, and more like a warning dressed up in legal vocabulary. By February, she was opening every envelope with her jaw already tight, bracing for whatever was inside. And then came the letter with the loan documents attached. Evelyn had read it twice at the kitchen table before the meaning fully landed. According to the paperwork, 4 pages of it, official-looking, stamped, signed. Thomas Mercer had taken out a significant loan against the property 8 years ago through a private lending company that had since been acquired by Hargrove Land Corporation. The loan had accrued interest. Thomas had allegedly made no payments. The debt had grown into a number that eclipsed the value of everything on the property. And because Thomas was dead and Evelyn was the surviving owner, the debt was now hers. She sat with those papers for a long time. Then she went to the lockbox in the bedroom closet, the one Thomas had kept since before they were married, where he put every important document they'd ever signed. And she went through it page by page, folder by folder. Every mortgage payment receipt going back 30 years. Every bill of sale. Every insurance document. Every contract. There was no loan, not a trace of one. And the signature on those 4 pages, say, the one that said Thomas Allen Mercer in a slightly forward-leaning cursive, was not her husband's handwriting. She had read his handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists and letters written from a cattle drive when they were young and newly married. She knew the way he made his capital T, the way the A in Allen looped slightly left. Whoever had signed that document had made a decent effort, but it wasn't Thomas. She didn't cry. She was too angry to cry. She called the only lawyer she knew, a woman named Patricia Dunn, who handled wills and property disputes out of a small office in Millhaven, the county seat. Patricia picked up on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Evelyn read the letter out loud. When Evelyn finished, there was a pause on the line. "Bring me everything," Patricia said. "Originals. Don't make copies yet. Don't send anything. Just bring it to me." "Is this as bad as it looks?" Another pause. Patricia was a careful woman who didn't say things she couldn't stand behind. "It's serious," she said, "but I want to see the documents before I tell you what I think." Evelyn drove into Millhaven the next morning with the lockbox on the passenger seat and Thomas's original deed in a manila envelope on top of everything else. Patricia spent 90 minutes going through it all. When she finally leaned back in her chair, she had the expression of someone who has just confirmed something she had hoped was wrong. "The signature is forged," Patricia said. "I can see it even without a handwriting expert. But that's actually the easy part. But what's the hard part?" "The hard part is that this document was filed with the county clerk's office 2 years ago. It's been in the public record. That means Hargrove's attorneys can argue it was valid until proven otherwise. And proving otherwise takes time and money and an expert witness." She folded her hands on the desk. "And they know that." Evelyn looked at her. "They did this on purpose. Waited until Thomas was gone and couldn't dispute it. That's what it looks like to me. Can we fight it?" Patricia looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people do when they're deciding how honest to be. "We can try," she said. "But Evelyn, you need to understand who you're dealing with. Hargrove has attorneys in 3 states. They've done this kind of thing before. I've heard about 2 other properties in the region where something similar happened, though I can't prove a connection yet. If they push this into federal court, the costs alone could—" "I'm not selling," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat and final, the way a door sounds when it's latched from the inside. "That's not a negotiation. That's just the fact." Patricia studied her face for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said. "Then we start building a case." Evelyn drove home in the dark, and the whole way back she kept both hands on the wheel and both eyes on the road, because she had learned a long time ago that when you're really frightened, the best thing you can do is drive straight and look ahead, and not let your hands shake until you're somewhere private. She got home at 9:40. The cattle were quiet. The house was cold, the way it got in February when the wind came from the northwest and found every gap in the old insulation that Thomas had always meant to fix. She turned up the thermostat and stood in the kitchen for a moment in her coat. The 2 cold cups of coffee from the morning were still on the counter. She'd never gotten around to washing them. She washed them now. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and started writing down everything she remembered. Every visit from the Hargrove representative, every letter, every date, every exact word she could recall. She was not a lawyer. She was not an investigator. She was a 62-year-old woman with arthritic knuckles and a ranch that was held together mostly by stubbornness and habit. But she had spent 31 years keeping records of everything: receipts, weather logs, cattle counts, vet visits, feed costs. Thomas had started the habit, and she had continued it. And now those notebooks, lined composition books going back 28 years sitting in a stack in the spare bedroom, might be the thing that saved everything they had built together. She wrote until midnight. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well. She hadn't slept well in months. The next morning she was back at it by 5:15 because the cattle still needed feeding and the broken section of east fence still needed a temporary repair, and the world did not pause because a corporation was trying to steal it from you. She was out behind the barn struggling with a fence post that had heaved out of the frozen ground when she heard tires on the gravel drive. Her first thought was that it was the Hargrove representative again. Her jaw went tight. She set down the post driver and walked around the barn, ready to say something she had been rehearsing for weeks. It wasn't the Hargrove truck. It was a faded blue pickup she didn't recognize, and the man who stepped out of it was nobody she'd seen before. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-50s, wearing a canvas jacket that had been through real weather. He had the kind of face that had been outside a long time. Not weathered in a rough way, just settled, like a landscape that stopped changing. He didn't come toward the house. He stood by his truck and looked at the fence line, then at the cattle pasture, then back at the fence line. Evelyn walked up and stopped about 10 feet from him. "Can I help you?" He looked at her without any particular expression. "Name's Silas Boone," he said. "I do some ranch work in the area. Heard from Pete Garrett over at the feed store that the Mercer place might need some help with repairs." "Pete Garrett talks too much," Evelyn said. Silas Boone looked like he might agree with that. "Probably. I'm not hiring. I didn't say anything about pay." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the broken fence post she'd been working on. "That one's heaved," he said. "Ground thawed and refroze about 4 times this winter. You've got probably 6 or 7 more like it on that east line." "I know how many I've got." "You want me to leave? I'll leave," he said. "But I've got a truck full of tools and nothing else going on today." Evelyn studied him. In her experience, people who showed up unannounced offering something for nothing generally wanted something in return. But there was nothing in his face that she could read as agenda. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, not pushing. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." She stood there for another moment, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the cattle and the particular quality of silence that belongs to early mornings in high country Montana. Then she said, "The post driver's behind the barn." He nodded once. He got his tools from the truck. He went to the east fence line without another word. Evelyn watched him for a few minutes from a distance, trying to work out what she was looking at. He knew what he was doing. That was clear. He didn't make a production of it. He just worked. And there was something about the way he moved, quiet and efficient and without any particular hurry, that reminded her unexpectedly of Thomas. Not in the way he looked. Thomas had been lean and fair where this man was broader and dark-haired going gray. But in the quality of the attention, the way he treated the work as something worth doing right. She turned away and went back to her own list of tasks, and she told herself she would keep an eye on him, and she told herself she still didn't trust him, and she told herself all of that was still true. Every bit of it. But she also, without quite deciding to, put on a second pot of coffee. By noon, he had fixed 9 fence posts and replaced a section of wire that had been sagging since November. He didn't come to the house to announce it or report it. She found out when she walked the east line herself after lunch. He had already left. The blue truck was gone. The fence was straight. On the top post of the repaired section, he had left something wedged in the staple, a folded piece of paper with a phone number written on it, and 4 words underneath. "Call if you need help. No name, no explanation. No invoice." Evelyn stood at the fence with the paper in her hand and the wind pulling at her hair and the knowledge sitting cold and heavy in her chest that in 2 weeks a corporation with lawyers in 3 states was going to try to take all of this from her. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She didn't call him. Not yet. But she didn't throw the paper away either. That night, she went through Thomas's composition books again, the ones from 8 years back, the year the forged loan was supposedly signed. She read every entry: weather, feed costs, a note about the well pump failing in July, the price of hay in October. Thomas's handwriting on every page. Careful, familiar, his. And then, in the notebook from that September, almost hidden between a cattle count and a note about a vet visit, she found something that made her go very still. 3 lines in Thomas's careful hand. Man came out from some company in Billings. Wanted to talk about leasing the mineral rights. Told him no. Pushy. Wouldn't take no for a first answer. Had to be firm. No company name. No date beyond the month. But Evelyn read those 3 lines 5 times, and when she looked up from the page, her face had changed. They had been here before. Before Thomas died. Before the letters. Before the loan documents with the forged signature. They had already been watching. She closed the notebook. She sat in the quiet house for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and somewhere at the back of the property, a door on the old equipment shed was banging against its frame, the way it always did when a front was coming in. She thought about the paper in her coat pocket. She thought about Patricia Dunn's careful, worried face across the desk. She thought about Thomas's handwriting in that notebook, and the handwriting on the loan documents that was supposed to be his and wasn't, and the particular ugliness of what that meant, that someone had practiced his signature, had studied it, had sat somewhere with a pen and a piece of paper and worked at making Thomas's name into a lie. The shed door kept banging. She'd meant to fix that latch for a month. She put on her coat and went out into the dark to fix it, because there are some nights when the only thing that keeps you from coming apart is having something you can actually do with your hands. She fixed the latch. She stood outside for a moment in the cold, looking up at the sky, which was heavy and gray with the front moving in. Then she went back inside. She picked up her legal pad. She wrote, September notebook, mineral rights inquiry, before everything. They planned this. She underlined it twice. Then she wrote one more line, and this one she didn't underline because it wasn't a note for the case. It was something else. A reminder. A promise to herself. I am not leaving. She kept that legal pad on the kitchen table from that night forward, the way some people keep a Bible, so not for comfort exactly, but for the act of returning to it, of adding to it, of proving to herself that what she knew was real and could be written down and held. The 14-day deadline in the first Hargrove letter came and went. Evelyn did not vacate. She did not call them. She did not send a response through Patricia. She simply stayed and worked and waited to see what they would do next. They sent a second letter on day 16. This one had the word final notice printed across the top in bold letters, the kind of formatting designed to make your heart rate spike. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and when she finished, she set it down next to the first letter, smoothing it flat with the palm of her hand the way you'd press a weed into a scrapbook. Evidence. All of it was evidence now. Patricia had filed a formal dispute with the county clerk's office challenging the legitimacy of the loan document. It wasn't much, not yet, but it put something official on record, a flag in the ground that said, this woman disputes this claim, and that mattered. It meant Hargrove couldn't just move forward as though the matter were settled. They had to respond. They responded by sending a different man. This one drove a black SUV, not a truck. He wore a suit jacket and no tie, the calculated kind of casual that costs money. He knocked on Evelyn's door at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, and when she opened it, he gave her a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes and introduced himself as Dale Pruitt, Senior Acquisitions Consultant for Hargrove Land Corporation. I'm not interested in a consultation, Evelyn said. Mrs. Mercer, I think if we just had a conversation, we're having one. I'm telling you I'm not selling and I'm not leaving, and I'd appreciate it if your company stopped sending me letters that say otherwise. Pruitt's smile flickered, just for a second, barely enough to catch, and then it was back. I understand this is emotional for you, he said. Losing your husband, managing this property alone. Nobody expects this to be easy. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She was aware, in the way you become aware of things when you've been paying close attention for a long time, that he had just tried something, that the words emotional and alone had been placed very deliberately, designed to make her feel small and reactive and foolish. "Get off my property," she said. "Don't come back without a lawyer present." She closed the door before he finished whatever he'd been about to say. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the doorknob, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating across the porch, the sound of the SUV door, the engine. When the gravel noise faded, she let go of the door and went back to the kitchen and sat down and wrote the entire exchange on her legal pad, word for word as best she could remember, with the time and date at the top. Her hand was shaking a little when she wrote. She noticed it and kept writing anyway. She called Patricia that afternoon. Patricia listened to the account of the visit and said, "Good. You handled it exactly right. Don't let them get you into a conversation without me present." Then she said, "I've been looking into that mineral rights inquiry Thomas wrote about in his notebook. And? I can't find a formal record of any company approaching landowners in Copper Ridge about mineral rights 8 years ago. But I did find something else." A pause, the kind Patricia used when she was choosing her words carefully. "There's a pattern in the county deed records. 7 properties along the Copper Ridge corridor that changed hands in the last 6 years. All of them originally owned by families who'd held the land for decades. All of them transferred after some kind of debt or legal dispute." She stopped. "How many of them had disputed loans?" Evelyn said. "I don't know yet. I'd need to look at each case individually. But Evelyn, 3 of those transfers happened within 8 months of the original owner dying." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn could hear the refrigerator hum. "They wait," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "That's what it looks like." She hung up the phone and sat there for a while with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the legal pad and the growing column of dates and names and facts that she had been building since the night she found Thomas's notebook entry. It was 3 days after the Pruitt visit that she finally called Silas Boone. She didn't call because she was frightened, or not only because of that. She called because she had walked the north fence line that morning and found 2 more posts heaved and a section of wire that was one hard winter away from giving out entirely. And she had stood there looking at the damage and thought about the 7 properties that had changed hands. And something in her that had been functioning on sheer momentum had wobbled, just slightly, under the weight of everything at once. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Yeah. It's Evelyn Mercer," she said. "Copper Ridge Road." A brief pause. "I remember. The north fence line needs work. I've got posts and wire, but I can't handle the driver alone without someone holding the other end." She stopped. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay for your time." "All right," he said. "I can come Thursday morning." 7:30. 7:30's fine. He hung up. She stared at the phone for a second, vaguely unsettled by how straightforward that had been. She'd been bracing for negotiation. He arrived at 7:28. She noticed that without meaning to. They worked the north fence for most of the morning without much conversation, which suited Evelyn fine. She had never been a woman who needed to fill silence. Silas seemed to operate the same way. He asked practical questions when he needed to, said what needed saying, and left everything else alone. By 10 they had reset 4 posts and were working on the wire splice when he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "How long have they been after you?" She looked at him. "What makes you think anyone's after me?" He kept working. "Pete Garrett told me about the Hargrove letters when he told me about the ranch needing work. I shouldn't have mentioned it, but I'm mentioning it because I've heard that name before." "Hargrove?" 3 years ago I was doing fence and pasture work for a man named Gerald Voss over near Ridgemont, about 40 miles east of here. He'd been running cattle on his family's land for 40 years. He paused, pulling the wire taut. He got a letter about a loan his wife had supposedly taken out before she passed. Same kind of thing. Documents filed with the county, signature that didn't look right, a number that would have wiped out the property. Evelyn's hands went still. What happened to him? Silas was quiet for a moment. He couldn't afford a lawyer who could fight it long enough. Lost the property 18 months ago. Last I heard, he was renting a single room in Ridgemont and had sold the cattle. The wind moved through the grass between the fence posts. Somewhere behind them, a meadowlark was working through its song, oblivious. "Did he fight it?" Evelyn said. "As long as he could. But he was doing it alone." She looked at Silas and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that wasn't quite said out loud. A mutual understanding that they were no longer just talking about fence posts. "I need to talk to him," Evelyn said. Silas nodded once, slowly. "I figured you'd say that." It took a week to arrange. Silas drove. Evelyn had offered to take her own truck, but Silas pointed out that Gerald Voss didn't know her, and that showing up with someone he recognized might make the difference between a door opening and a door staying shut. That was practical reasoning, and Evelyn appreciated practical reasoning, so she sat in the passenger seat of the blue truck for 40 miles through high country terrain and watched the landscape run past and thought about what she was going to say. She didn't have a speech prepared. She almost never did. Gerald Voss lived in a ground-floor apartment in a cinder-block building on the edge of Ridgemont that was the kind of place nobody chose. The kind of place you ended up. He was 71, broader than he used to be, and he looked at Evelyn from his doorway with the guarded expression of a man who had been through something that had made him cautious about strangers. "Silas said you've been having trouble with Hargrove," he said. "They forged my husband's signature on a loan document," Evelyn said. "My husband has been dead for 14 months. Something shifted in Gerald's face. "Come in," he said. They sat in his small living room and Gerald talked for a long time, and Evelyn listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she was genuinely good at. The story was different in its details and identical in its structure. The initial approach, the polite offers, the refusal, the escalation, the document that appeared from nowhere bearing a dead person's name. In Gerald's case, it had been his wife, Margaret, who had supposedly signed the loan 3 years before her death from cancer. "She never signed anything without telling me," Gerald said. 42 years. "She never kept a secret from me a day in her life." He said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. "Did you try to fight the signature?" Evelyn asked. "I got a handwriting person to look at it. She said it wasn't Margaret's. But the document had been sitting in the county record for 2 years by then, and Hargrove's lawyers kept filing motions and delays and extensions, and every month it cost me more money I didn't have." He looked at his hands. "Eventually I ran out." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I see the paperwork? What you still have of it?" He looked at her. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to compare it to mine," she said, "because if they used the same method twice, that's not incompetence and it's not coincidence. That's a system." Gerald got up and went to a cardboard box in the bedroom closet. He came back with a folder that was thick and battered around the edges. He put it on the coffee table between them. "I don't know what good it'll do," he said. "Maybe none," Evelyn said honestly. "But I'd rather know than not know." She sat at Gerald's coffee table for 2 hours with the folder spread open, reading. Silas sat in the corner chair and said nothing. Gerald made coffee and then seemed to forget about it. What Evelyn found in those documents, cross-referencing against the copies she had brought from her own file, was a pattern so specific it made her stomach turn. The notary seal on Gerald's loan document was from an office in Billings. The notary seal on her own was from a different office in Billings, a different name, but the same format, the same stamped style, the same slightly off-center placement on the page. The language in both documents used identical phrasing in 2 key sections, word for word, in places where you'd expect variation if 2 different lawyers had drafted them independently. And the filing dates. Gerald's had been filed with the county clerk 14 months after his wife's diagnosis was documented publicly. Evelyn's had been filed 11 months after Thomas's first hospitalization. They were watching. They had been watching for years. She drove back from Ridgemont with the folder in her lap and the window cracked 2 inches because she needed the cold air to think straight. "You're going to take this to Patricia," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And then?" She thought about the 7 properties Patricia had mentioned. She thought about Gerald Voss in his cinder-block apartment. She thought about the pattern, the waiting, the timing, the identical language in documents that were supposed to be unconnected. "Then I'm going to find out if there are others," she said. Finding them was harder than she'd expected. Patricia did what she could through public records, but public records only told you what had been officially filed, not what the people behind those filings had actually experienced. The stories were scattered. in different counties, different court systems. Some of them never formally contested because the owners had simply run out of money or will or both. Evelyn started making phone calls. She did it from the kitchen table, in the evenings after the ranch work was done, with her legal pad open beside her and a list of names that Patricia had compiled from cross-referencing deed transfers with death records across 4 Montana counties. It was slow, painstaking, and frequently frustrating. Some numbers were disconnected. Some people hung up when they heard the word Hargrove. One woman, a widow named Ruth Calloway, who had lost a small operation near Denton, cried on the phone for 5 minutes before she could speak clearly. And even then she said, "I don't see how talking about it helps anything." "It might not help just from talking," Evelyn said. "But if your documents look like mine and Gerald Voss's documents look like mine, then what happened to us isn't 3 separate things. It's one thing. And one thing can be fought differently than 3 separate losses." A long silence on the line. "They had Margaret Voss's signature on theirs too?" "No, they had my husband's. Gerald's had his wife's, but the documents are almost identical underneath the names." Another silence. "How do you know Gerald Voss?" "I drove out to meet him," Evelyn said. "I sat in his living room and looked at his paperwork." Ruth Calloway was quiet for a moment. "You actually went and sat with him?" "Yes." "Nobody ever—" She stopped, started again. "Nobody ever actually came out to talk to any of us. The lawyers just sent letters." "I know," Evelyn said. "I think that's part of how they won." Ruth Calloway agreed to send copies of her documents. They arrived 4 days later, a thick envelope that Evelyn opened at the kitchen table and spread out next to her own papers and Gerald's, and there it was again. The same notary format, the same language, in the same sections. And a filing date that Patricia confirmed was 8 months after Ruth's husband had been admitted to a care facility with a diagnosis of advanced dementia, publicly recorded, easily searchable. They were targeting people who couldn't speak for themselves anymore. Evelyn wrote that on her legal pad and then sat looking at it for a long time, and the anger that moved through her wasn't the hot, impulsive kind. It was the cold, settled kind that doesn't burn out, the kind that calculates. She called Patricia the next morning and told her what she had. Patricia was quiet for a moment after Evelyn finished. Then she said, "This changes the scope of what we're doing." "I know. If we can establish a pattern across multiple counties, multiple victims, with the same documentary fingerprints, this isn't a property dispute anymore. This is a fraud case, potentially a federal case." "Who would handle that?" "A U.S. attorney, if we can get one interested." "But Evelyn, to get there, we need more than what you have right now. We need an expert to formally certify the forgeries. We need a clear chain showing the same actors in each case. And we need people who are willing to testify, not just send documents, but actually stand up and say what happened to them." Evelyn looked at her legal pad. The column of names, the dates, the matching language she had marked in yellow highlighter across 3 sets of documents. "How long?" "Months, maybe more." "And in the meantime," Patricia said carefully, "we do not give them anything. We don't respond to their letters, we don't engage with their representatives, and we do not let them get a default judgment while we're building the case. I'll keep filing extensions and challenges in county court to buy time." "What about the county records themselves?" Evelyn said. "The original deed records for Copper Ridge. Not the disputed ones, the originals. Thomas filed everything when we first bought the property. If those are in the county archive, they might show something about when Hargrove first started sniffing around this area." Patricia paused. "That's actually a good thought. The county archive goes back to territorial days, but those records aren't always easy to access. Some of them are in storage, not digitized." "I know someone who knows the county," Evelyn said. She meant Silas. Not because he had connections, she didn't know enough about him to claim that, but because he had been working ranch land in Harlan County for long enough that he knew people, the kind of people who knew where things were kept and who to ask. She mentioned it to him the next morning when he showed up to help her with a water trough that had cracked during the last freeze. He was on his knees looking at the split in the concrete when she said it, and he didn't look up right away. The county archive has a records room in the basement of the old courthouse building, he said. The woman who runs it is named Darlene Marsh. She's been there 20-something years. She knows everything in those files better than the county does. Would she let me look? It's public record. She'd let anyone look. Whether she helps you find what you're looking for is a different question. He sat back on his heels. I went to school with her son. That might be worth something. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. He was still looking at the cracked trough, his expression the same as it always was. Quiet, focused, giving nothing away unnecessarily. Why are you helping me? She said. He glanced up. Because someone should. She waited, but that seemed to be all of it. She turned that over for a moment, looking for something behind it, some angle, some agenda, and found nothing she could identify, which didn't mean it wasn't there. But she had gotten better at reading people over the past few months of paying close attention, and what she read in Silas Boone, as far as she could tell, was exactly what it looked like. A man who was good at ranch work and had decided that what was happening to her was wrong. She didn't trust easily, and she didn't start now. But she updated her file slightly, the way a careful person does when evidence warrants it. Set up the meeting, she said. Darlene Marsh was a small woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular manner of someone who has spent decades being the only person who actually understood how her systems worked. She met them in the basement of the old courthouse building, which smelled like old paper and humidity. And she looked at Evelyn with the appraising expression of someone who could tell the difference between a curious visitor and a person with a specific purpose. You want the original Copper Ridge corridor deed filings, she said. Starting from about 25 years ago, yes. And I want to see anything that shows corporate interest in that area. Any filings from outside entities looking at mineral rights or land acquisitions. Darlene studied her for a moment. Then she glanced at Silas. Your mom's hip doing better, she said. A lot better, he said. She wanted me to tell you thank you for the casserole. Something softened slightly in Darlene's face. She looked back at Evelyn. The mineral rights inquiries will be in a different ledger from the deed filings, she said. I'll pull both, but it's going to take me a while to find what you're looking for, and you're going to have to look through it yourself. I can't tell you what's in there until you've read it. I understand, Evelyn said. Darlene pulled ledgers. Evelyn read. Silas sat in a folding chair against the wall and occasionally held pages flat while Evelyn photographed them with her phone. The basement was cold and the fluorescent light overhead flickered every few minutes, and Evelyn's eyes started aching after the first hour. But she kept going because she had learned in the past few months that important things were almost never where you expected them to be or as easy to find as you hoped, and the only way through was to keep looking. She found it in the third ledger, a corporate inquiry filed 12 years ago, not 8, but 12, under a subsidiary name she didn't recognize, Ridgeline Resource Partners. The inquiry was for mineral rights evaluation across 7 parcels in the Copper Ridge corridor. 7. The same number Patricia had identified in the deed transfers. The filing listed a registered agent in Billings. She photographed every page. In the fourth ledger, she found a follow-up filing 2 years later showing that the inquiry had been formally withdrawn. But attached to the withdrawal, stapled to the back, easy to miss if you weren't looking, was a single page with a handwritten note in the margin. Old ink, faded but legible. See Hargrove file, consolidated under parent entity per Directive 11/14. Evelyn looked at that note for a long time. Then she looked at Silas. Ridgeline Resource Partners, she said quietly. That's them. That's Hargrove, 12 years ago, under a different name. Silas leaned over and read it. His jaw tightened slightly. They've been planning this for 12 years. Longer, maybe, Evelyn said. This is just the first record I can find. She photographed the page with the handwritten note 3 times from different angles. Her hands were steadier than they should have been, she thought. Steadier than she felt. Darlene Marsh, who had been quietly reshelving ledgers nearby and pretending not to listen, said without turning around, Whatever you found in there, make sure you have copies before you leave this building. Things have a way of going missing when powerful interests are involved. Evelyn looked at the back of the older woman's head. Has anyone else come in here asking about Copper Ridge records in the past few years? A brief pause. I'm not supposed to answer that kind of question, Darlene said. She continued shelving books. But I'll tell you that 2 years ago, a man in a suit came in here claiming to be doing a title search for a property sale. He was very interested in the old mineral rights ledgers. He didn't find what he was looking for because the ledger he wanted was temporarily misfiled. A very slight pause. I misfiled it myself after I saw what he was looking at. Evelyn looked at Silas. Silas looked at Evelyn. Thank you, Evelyn said to Darlene Marsh, for everything. Darlene finally turned around. She met Evelyn's eyes. Those families who lost their land, she said. Some of them I knew. Gerald Voss, I knew his wife from years back. Good people. She put a ledger on the shelf with a firm, decisive push. Don't let them get away with it. Evelyn drove home that evening with photographs of county records that potentially showed a 12-year premeditated scheme to strip ranching families of their land. Photographs that, combined with Patricia's pattern evidence and the forged documents from 3 different properties, were beginning to look less like a collection of individual grievances and more like the outline of something a federal attorney might actually take seriously. It wasn't enough yet. She knew that. Patricia would tell her the same thing. They needed the expert on the signatures. They needed witnesses willing to stand up. They needed a chain of evidence that could survive a courtroom with Hargrove's lawyers in it. But she had something she hadn't had 3 weeks ago, proof that this had started long before Thomas died. That Hargrove, or whatever they were calling themselves 12 years ago, had looked at the Copper Ridge corridor and made a decision, and then waited with extraordinary patience for the right moment to act. They had waited for people to get sick and die and leave their spouses alone. And then they had moved. Evelyn sat in her kitchen that night with the photographs arranged on the table and her legal pad open and the notes she'd been building for months spread out around her. And she thought about Gerald Voss in his cinder block room. She thought about Ruth Calloway crying on the phone. She thought about Thomas's 3 careful lines in the September notebook. Man came out from some company in Billings. Told him no. Had to be firm. Thomas had told them no and been firm about it, and they had written his name down somewhere and waited for him to die. She picked up her pen. She added the new findings to the legal pad, precise and specific, every detail. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What we still need." Underneath it she wrote 4 items. Expert on signatures. More victims willing to testify. Link between Ridgeline Resource Partners and current Hargrove entity. Federal jurisdiction trigger. 4 things. Each of them hard. None of them impossible. Outside, the wind had died down. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were settled. The fences on the east and north lines were straight and solid because someone had taken the time to fix them right. She closed the legal pad and sat in the quiet for a while, and she thought about all the things she still didn't know and all the things she couldn't control and the 14-day deadline that had already passed and the final notice letter that was sitting in a folder in the second drawer. Then she thought about Darlene Marsh's face when she'd said, "Don't let them get away with it." She thought about the straight fence line in the dark. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and this time, for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep before midnight. The expert Patricia found was named Dr. Carol Winslow, and she was not the kind of person Evelyn had expected. Evelyn had imagined someone academic and dry, the sort who would speak in qualifications and hedge every statement until it meant nothing. What she got instead was a compact woman in her late 50s who had spent 20 years as a forensic document examiner for the FBI before going private, and who looked at the loan documents spread across Patricia's conference table with the focused expression of someone who has seen exactly this before and is deciding how angry to let herself be about it. She didn't touch the originals. She looked at them through a magnifier for a long time, moving methodically from section to section, and then she sat back and took off her glasses and said, "Where did you get the comparison samples?" "Thomas's composition books," Evelyn said. 28 years of them. Same pen style throughout. "Good." Dr. Winslow looked at the loan signature again. "The person who did this wasn't guessing. They had a sample to work from. You can see the effort in the pressure points. They were trying to match the natural inconsistencies in his writing, which is actually what people who forge signatures do wrong. Real signatures are inconsistent in the same ways every time. Forgeries are inconsistent in different ways." She set the magnifier down. "This is a forgery. I can certify that in writing, and I will testify to it under oath." Patricia wrote something on her notepad. "Timeline for the written report?" 2 weeks if you need it faster, 3 if you let me do it right. 3, Patricia said. Do it right. After Dr. Winslow left, Evelyn sat across from Patricia in the empty conference room, and they looked at each other for a moment without speaking, the way people do when something significant has just happened and neither of them wants to say the obvious thing out loud for fear of jinxing it. Patricia said it anyway. That's the cornerstone. The expert certification on the forgery, combined with the county records and the pattern across multiple properties. That's what gets a federal attorney in a room with us. How do we get a federal attorney in a room with us? Patricia turned her pen over in her fingers. I know someone, Frank Alderman, out of the Billings U.S. Attorney's Office. I've worked with him on a land fraud case about 5 years ago. Nothing this size, but he understands the territory. I can call him. Will he take it? I don't know, Patricia said, and Evelyn appreciated that she didn't dress it up. He'll look at what we have. Whether he thinks it meets the threshold for federal prosecution is his call. Evelyn nodded. Make the call. She drove home with the windows down despite the cold, the way she sometimes did when she needed to stay sharp. The ranch looked the same when she pulled in, still battered, still fighting winter, the east barn still listing slightly to the left in a way Thomas had always said he'd fix eventually. But the fences were straight, and the cattle count had held steady through March, and there were small things that were better than they'd been in November, small things that she had made better herself, one at a time. Silas's truck was parked at the edge of the driveway. He was on the roof of the smaller outbuilding, replacing shingles that had blown off in the February wind. He looked down when she got out of her truck. How'd it go? He called. The expert confirmed the forgery, she said. He was quiet for a moment, hammer in hand against the gray sky. Good, he said. You don't have to keep doing this, she said, meaning the roof, meaning all of it. I know, he said, and went back to the shingles. She watched him for a moment, this man she still didn't fully know, who showed up and worked and didn't require her to be grateful in any particular way. She had stopped trying to figure out what he wanted from it. Some things didn't have a hidden motive. She was still getting used to that. She went inside and called Ruth Calloway. Ruth had been cautiously cooperative since their first conversation, sending documents, answering questions, but always with a guarded quality, like someone who had learned to check the ground before putting weight on it. Evelyn had been patient with that. She understood it from the inside. The document expert confirmed the forgery on our paperwork, Evelyn said when Ruth picked up. And we're going to the federal level. But Ruth, I need to know if you're willing to come forward formally, to testify. A long silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the thinking kind. What does that mean exactly? Ruth said. Testify in front of who? A federal court, eventually. If we get there. It would mean having your documents examined, giving a statement, potentially appearing in court. I haven't been in a courtroom in my life, Ruth said. Neither have I. Another silence. Are you scared? Ruth said. Evelyn thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, but I'm more scared of what happens if we don't do this. She heard Ruth breathe on the other end of the line. My husband worked that land for 38 years, Ruth said finally, and they took it for a document nobody can prove he signed. A pause. All right, tell me what you need. Gerald Voss agreed the same day on the phone in about 40 seconds. He didn't need a long conversation. Evelyn suspected he'd been waiting for someone to call him with exactly this question. There were 2 other families that Patricia had identified as potential witnesses. The Heller family, who had lost a small spread near Roundup, and a man named Dale Sutton who had walked away from a property dispute 2 years earlier after his attorney had advised him the case was unwinnable. Dale Sutton was the hard one. Evelyn called him on a Thursday evening, and he picked up and listened without saying anything while she explained who she was and what she was building. When she finished, there was such a long silence that she thought the call had dropped. You there? She said. I'm here, he said. I walked away because they told me I couldn't win. I know. I sold my equipment. I sold the cattle. I moved into my daughter's garage. His voice was flat, not self-pitying, just stating facts. You're telling me all of that was based on a forgery. That's what the evidence suggests. We don't know your specific documents yet, but the pattern... I have my documents, he said. I kept everything. My daughter wanted me to throw it all out, and I wouldn't. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Can I come see them? When? Saturday, if that works. Yeah, he said. Saturday works. She drove to Dale Sutton's daughter's house in Roundup on Saturday with Silas, partly because Silas had a better sense of the geography, and partly because she'd found in the past few weeks that having him there didn't make things harder. He had a quality of stillness that kept a room from escalating, and she'd learned to value that. Dale Sutton was 68 and looked like a man who had been physically strong most of his life and found that strength suddenly useless. He met them at the door of his daughter's house and brought them into the kitchen, and his daughter, a woman in her 30s named Kim, stood in the doorway looking at Evelyn with an expression that was equal parts hope and suspicion. The documents Dale spread on Kim's kitchen table had the same fingerprints as all the others. The notary format, the language in the critical sections, word for word, and the timing. His wife had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 4 years ago. The loan document bearing her signature had been filed 3 months later. Kim Sutton, who had been quiet in the doorway, said, "They did this while Mom was still alive," in a voice that was very controlled and very angry. "That's what the filing date suggests," Evelyn said. "She wouldn't have known what she was signing," Kim said. "Even 3 months after the diagnosis, she wouldn't have—" She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "We don't think she signed anything," Evelyn said carefully. "We think the signature is forged, the same as the others, but we'll need an expert to examine it." Dale looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Evelyn. "What do you need from me?" "Your documents and your story," Evelyn said, "and eventually, if we get to court, your presence." "I'll be there," he said. Before she could respond, he added, "I should have fought harder the first time. My lawyer said it was unwinnable, and I believed him." His voice didn't carry blame or self-pity, just the weight of a conclusion reached too late. "I'm not making that mistake again." Frank Alderman met with Patricia and Evelyn 3 weeks later in a conference room at the Federal Building in Billings. He was in his late 40s, with the slightly tired look of someone who dealt professionally with people who had done terrible things. And he listened to the full presentation, the forged documents, the expert certification, the county records showing the Ridgeline Resource Partners filing and its connection to Hargrove, the 5 victim families with nearly identical experiences, without interrupting for 40 minutes. When Patricia finished, Alderman looked at the stack of materials on the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. "How did you put all this together?" he said. "Legal pad and a phone," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional recognition. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. "This is significant. If the pattern holds across the discovery process, we're looking at wire fraud, mail fraud, potentially RICO implications. That's serious federal territory." "But," Patricia said, "but it's going to take time to build a prosecutable case, and in the meantime, Hargrove is going to know we're looking. When they know, they'll move." "Move how?" Evelyn said. "Accelerate. Push your county case harder. Try to get a judgment before we can intervene at the federal level." He paused. "Mrs. Mercer, your ranch is still the most exposed property in this cluster. If they get a default judgment against you in county court before we establish federal jurisdiction, it complicates everything." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Then we make sure they don't." Alderman studied her. "You understand that if I open an investigation, you're going to become the primary target of every legal maneuver they have. They'll attack your credibility, your finances, your late husband's history. They'll look for anything." "They've been trying to take my home for months," Evelyn said. "I don't see how this makes it worse." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, I'm going to need copies of everything, and I'm going to need your witnesses to submit formal statements." "They'll do that," Evelyn said. "You sure?" "Yes." She said it without hesitation because she was sure. She had sat with these people in their kitchens and their small apartments and their daughter's spare rooms, and she knew the particular quality of anger that comes not from impulsiveness, but from having been patient for too long. They would hold. Alderman nodded slowly. "Give me 2 weeks to review everything. If I move forward, we move quietly at first. No press, no announcements. The moment Hargrove knows the federal government is looking at them, they'll burn what they can and lawyer up harder than they already have. Understood, Patricia said. They drove back from Billings in the late afternoon, the mountains catching the last light on the western faces, and Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not relief, it was too early for relief, but something adjacent to it. The sense that the weight she'd been carrying was now distributed across more sets of shoulders, and that the ground under her feet was slightly more solid than it had been that morning. He's going to take it, Patricia said. You think? I've worked with Frank Alderman. When he says, give me 2 weeks to review, he's already made up his mind. He just needs to build the internal case to bring it upstairs. She glanced at Evelyn. He would have said no today if he was going to say no. Evelyn nodded. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, what happens to Gerald and Ruth and Dale if this falls apart? Patricia was quiet for a moment. They lose. The same way they were already losing. So they've got nothing to lose by trying. And everything to gain. Patricia looked at the road. Same as you. It was nearly dark when Evelyn got home. The ranch was quiet and the cold had a real bite to it, the kind that said winter wasn't done arguing yet. She walked the east fence line out of habit, the way she did most evenings now, not because she expected to find something wrong, but because the act of walking her own ground, checking it, owning it with her feet and her eyes, had become something she needed. The fence was straight. She ran her hand along one of the posts Silas had set in February, the concrete solid, not a wobble in it. She was almost back to the house when the black SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. She stopped. She watched it come up the drive and park. Dale Pruitt got out. Not the suit jacket version this time, but something harder in his posture, the negotiator's polish stripped away. He stood by the vehicle and looked at her across the darkening yard. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I was hoping we could talk. We talked, Evelyn said. She didn't move toward him. I want to make you a different kind of offer. He walked toward her a few steps. The litigation process is going to be long and expensive. I think you know that. What we're prepared to offer tonight is a clean resolution, full market value for the property, plus a figure to cover your relocation and transition costs. You'd walk away with enough to buy something smaller, something manageable, and none of the legal risk. Evelyn looked at him. You drove out here tonight, she said. I wanted to speak to you directly. At 7 o'clock, without calling ahead. She held his gaze. You're scared of something. Something moved behind his eyes. Not much, but enough. I'm trying to resolve this before it gets worse for everyone. What happened? Evelyn said. Did someone start asking questions about Ridgeline Resource Partners? The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long, but it was the loudest 2 seconds of the entire conversation. Pruitt's face didn't change. He was too practiced for that. But his stillness changed. It got the quality of a man who has just heard something he didn't expect to hear and is rapidly recalculating. I don't know what that is, he said. I think you do, Evelyn said. She crossed her arms. Mr. Pruitt, I'm going to tell you the same thing I've told everyone else your company has sent out here. I'm not selling. I'm not leaving. And the next conversation your company has with me will be in a courtroom. He stood there for a moment. Some of the practiced professionalism had thinned, and underneath it was something less comfortable. Not quite anger, but something close to it. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. For who? She said. He looked at her for another moment, then he went back to the SUV. He pulled out of the driveway without another word, the headlights sweeping across the fence line as he turned. Evelyn watched him go. She stood in the dark yard until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then she went inside, picked up the phone, and called Patricia. Hargrove just sent Pruitt out here in person, she said. Evening visit, no notice. He mentioned relocation costs and used the phrase legal risk. And when I said the words Ridgeline Resource Partners, he knew exactly what I was talking about. Patricia was quiet for 3 seconds. How sure are you? As sure as I've ever been of anything. That means someone talked, Patricia said. Someone at the county level or someone near Alderman's office. They know we're building something. Or they figured it out on their own when Darlene Marsh pulled those ledgers, Evelyn said. She'd thought about this on the drive back from Billings, the possibility that their visit to the county archive had been noticed. Either way, they're going to move faster now, Patricia said. I'm calling Frank Alderman tonight. This changes the timeline. Alderman called Evelyn directly the next morning. It was 7:15. She was in the barn. I'm opening the investigation, he said without preamble. Formally, as of today. I'm going to need you and your witnesses available for interviews starting next week. We'll be available, Evelyn said. Mrs. Mercer, they're going to fight back hard when they figure out what's happening. I need you to be prepared for that. I've been prepared, she said, since the first letter. She hung up and stood in the barn for a moment with the phone in her hand and the smell of hay and cattle around her, the ordinary, worn, real smell of a working ranch. Outside, one of the cows was complaining about something in a low, persistent way, the sound entirely unimpressed with the scale of what was happening to the person who fed her. Evelyn smiled at that just slightly and went to see what the cow wanted. The 2 weeks that followed were the most complicated of the whole fight, and the most exhausting in a way that the earlier months hadn't been, because the earlier months had been about gathering and building, and this was about holding ground while everything came at her at once. Hargrove filed 2 emergency motions in county court in the same week, both designed to accelerate the debt judgment before the federal investigation could establish jurisdiction. Patricia responded to both, fighting each motion with the careful, grinding precision of someone who is prepared for exactly this and is not going to be rushed. Gerald Voss drove 4 hours to give his formal statement to Alderman's office. Ruth Calloway came the day after, with a folder of documents she'd kept in a shoebox under her bed for 2 years. Dale Sutton brought Kim, who sat in the waiting area the whole time her father was in the interview room and didn't complain once. The Heller family sent their oldest son as their representative, a man of about 40 who had grown up on the ranch his parents had lost and still worked land nearby, and who walked into the federal building with the particular expression of a person who has been waiting a long time to be in exactly this room. Evelyn gave her own statement on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 hours with Alderman and 2 members of his team, going through every detail in order. The first Hargrove visit, the letters, the forged documents, Thomas's notebook entry, the county archive, Ridgeline Resource Partners, the handwritten marginal note that connected the 2 entities. She talked for 2 hours without notes because she had been living with these facts for so long they had become part of her own architecture, as familiar as the layout of the farmhouse, as solid as the fence posts on the east line. When it was done, Alderman walked her to the elevator and said, "You built a strong record." "Thomas built the record," Evelyn said. "He kept everything. I just knew where to look." She drove home in the last of the afternoon light, through terrain that was finally starting to soften toward spring, the snow retreating from the lower elevations and the grass underneath it pale and flattened but alive. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, the way she did when she needed to think, or sometimes when she just needed the quiet. When she got home, Silas's truck was there. He was in the small pasture, checking on the cattle, moving along the fence with a slow, methodical attention that she recognized as thoroughness rather than worry. She parked and sat in the truck for a moment, watching him without meaning to. She thought about something Ruth Calloway had said on the phone weeks ago, almost as an aside. "I don't know how you keep going. I stopped being able to get up at a normal time after we lost the property. Just couldn't make myself." Evelyn had said something polite in response, something about taking it one day at a time, which was true as far as it went. What she hadn't said was that some mornings she woke up at 5:15. Not because she had decided to, but because her body had simply learned that stopping was not an option and had stopped offering it as one. That the alarm was almost redundant. That there were mornings she lay in bed for 60 seconds and heard Thomas's voice in the exact quality of the pre-dawn silence. Not words, just the presence of him. The way a room still holds warmth after the fire goes out. And then she got up, because that was the agreement she had made with herself on the kitchen floor the night the letter arrived. She got out of the truck. Silas looked up when she came through the gate. He read her face the way he'd learned to over these months, quickly, without making a production of it. "How'd it go?" he said. "Alderman thinks we have a strong case," she said. "The witnesses all came through. The documents are with his team." He nodded. He looked at the cattle for a moment, then back at her. "You look tired." "I am tired," she said, which was more than she would have admitted 4 months ago. "Go eat something," he said. "I'll finish checking the fence." She looked at him. She wanted to say something about how she was perfectly capable of checking her own fence, and how she didn't need to be told to eat, and how she had been managing this ranch without assistance for 14 months before he showed up. All of that was true. She also recognized that he wasn't saying she couldn't do it. He was saying she didn't have to do it alone tonight. "There's soup on the stove if you want some," she said. "When you're done." He looked mildly surprised. He covered it quickly. "All right," he said. She went inside. She ate. She wrote on the legal pad for a while, not because there was anything new to record, but because the habit of it had become its own kind of anchor. She was still at the table when Hargrove made their next move. It came at 9:30 that evening, not as a letter this time, but as a phone call. A number she didn't recognize, and a voice she did. Richard Hargrove himself, the man whose name was on the corporation. She had never heard him speak before. He had always sent representatives. That he was calling personally at 9:30 at night told her something Patricia had said was true. They were frightened. His voice was measured and smooth and entirely sure of itself, the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his word ended conversations. He said her name, got the pleasantries out of the way in 3 seconds, and then said, "I want you to understand what's coming if you continue down this road." "I'm listening," Evelyn said. "The federal investigation your attorney has encouraged is going to drag every aspect of your husband's financial history into public record. His medical costs, his estate, anything that looks like mismanagement of this property over the last decade. We have attorneys whose entire job is to complicate that picture. By the time they're done, the narrative around Thomas Mercer's death and your subsequent handling of this estate is going to be something you won't want on the public record." The silence in Evelyn's kitchen was very complete. She thought about Thomas's composition books, the careful record of 31 years. The line in September had to be firm. She thought about what it would mean to let someone take those books into a courtroom and make something dirty out of them, something ugly. She felt the full weight of that threat, which was real and specific and designed with great precision to hit exactly where she was most exposed. She sat with it for a moment. She let herself feel it. Then she said, "Mr. Hargrove, I want you to understand something. You just called a witness in a federal fraud investigation and made what sounds very much like a threat. I have a phone that records calls. I'm going to send this recording to Frank Alderman's office tonight." The line was very quiet. "I'd suggest," Evelyn said, "that you stop calling me." She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that. And she sat at the table and breathed for a moment, and then she picked up the phone and called Patricia. And then she sent the recording, and then she sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, with the legal pad open and the pen in her hand. She didn't write anything. She just sat. After a while, she heard Silas's boots on the porch. He'd stayed later than she expected, still working in the dark, because he had apparently decided the south fence section needed attention, and he wasn't the type to leave something half done. He knocked twice before opening the back door, which was something he had started doing a month ago without either of them commenting on it. He saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Hargrove called me himself," she said. "Made threats about Thomas." Silas stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She told him what had been said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He's scared." "I know. Scared people make mistakes." "I know that too," she said. He looked at the legal pad, all the months of notes, the columns of dates and names, the yellow highlighted sections, and the underlined conclusions. He looked at it the way you look at something that represents an enormous amount of a specific kind of human effort. Not impressed exactly, but quietly acknowledging. "You gonna be all right?" he said. Evelyn looked at the legal pad. She thought about Thomas, about the composition books, about Gerald and Ruth and Dale Sutton in his daughter's garage, about Darlene Marsh pushing a ledger onto a shelf. Don't let them get away with it. "Yes," she said, and she meant it, even with the shaking hands, even with the threat still sitting in the air of the room. She meant it because the alternative was the one thing she had never seriously considered. Not once. Not from the night she sat on the kitchen floor with the first letter, the alternative of stopping. She was not going to stop. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear and enormous, and somewhere on the south fence line there was a section that Silas had just made right, and the cattle were quiet, and the legal pad was full. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote, "Hargrove called. Recording sent to Alderman. They are scared." Then she wrote underneath it, in the same even hand she used for feed costs and cattle counts, and all the ordinary facts of a life spent working land. "We are not done." The recording of Richard Hargrove's phone call reached Frank Alderman's office at 11:17 that night, and by 8 the following morning, Patricia had a call back from one of Alderman's team members saying the recording had been reviewed, logged as evidence, and that Alderman wanted a meeting within 48 hours. Evelyn drove to that meeting alone. Patricia offered to come, and Evelyn said no, she'd be fine, which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough. She needed the drive. She needed the 2 hours each way of empty highway and her own thoughts, without anyone else's worry crowding the car. Alderman looked like he'd been working since before sunrise. There were 2 other people in the room she hadn't met, a younger woman he introduced as his investigative lead, and a man in his 50s named Briggs, who had the quiet, assessing quality of someone from a different agency entirely. Nobody clarified which agency. Evelyn didn't ask. "The phone call changes the posture of this case significantly," Alderman said. "Witness intimidation, if we can establish that's what it was, gives us additional grounds, and it tells us something important about where Hargrove is right now." "They're scared," Evelyn said. The same thing Silas had said, and she believed it more now in the daylight than she had the night before. "Scared and calculating," Alderman said. "Don't mistake those for the same thing. Scared people who are also smart and well-resourced make dangerous moves, not just mistakes." He looked at the folder on the table in front of him. In the last 72 hours, Hargrove's attorneys filed for an emergency injunction in federal district court to block our investigation on grounds of procedural overreach. They're also claiming that the county records your attorney used to establish the pattern were accessed improperly. "Darlene Marsh let us in," Evelyn said. "Those are public records." "I know that. Their claim won't hold, but it costs time and it costs resources to respond to, which is exactly what it's designed to do." He paused. "There's something else. We found a name in Hargrove's corporate filing history, a county-level employee who served as notary on several of the fraudulent loan documents across different counties. Name is Warren Teal. He worked for the Harlan County Clerk's office until about 18 months ago. Evelyn went very still. 18 months ago, she said. "He resigned shortly after Thomas Mercer's death became publicly recorded," Alderman said. "We don't think that's a coincidence. We've had a team trying to locate him for the past week." "Did you find him?" Alderman and the woman he'd introduced as his investigative lead exchanged a brief look. "We found him," he said. "He's in Missoula. He's not currently employed, and according to our preliminary contact with him, he's been expecting someone to knock on his door for about a year." The room was quiet for a moment. Evelyn looked at Alderman. "He'll talk?" "He's talking to our team today," Alderman said. "His attorney is present. We don't know yet what he'll give us or what he'll ask for in return." He leaned forward slightly. "But, Mrs. Mercer, if he confirms what we think he knows, that he was paid to notarize forged documents across multiple counties, that he has records of who directed him and when, then we don't just have a pattern. We have a direct chain from the forgeries to Hargrove's corporate leadership." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. 14 months of working in the dark, building a case from composition books and county ledgers and kitchen table phone calls, and now a man in Missoula who had apparently been sitting with a guilty conscience for a year was about to either make all of it real or complicate everything further. "What do you need from me right now?" she said. "I need you to be patient for about 10 days, Alderman said. "I know that's hard given the county court pressure. Patricia is handling those motions." "Every one of them." "Good. Don't give them anything to work with. Don't talk to press if they come, and they may come, because Hargrove's legal filings are public record, and someone will put it together eventually. Don't engage with any Hargrove representatives." He paused. "And Mrs. Mercer, document everything. Every contact, every unusual vehicle at the property, every conversation that feels off. You've been doing that already. Keep doing it. She drove home through a landscape that was pulling itself gradually towards something that looked like spring, though real warmth was still weeks away. The grass along the highway shoulders was the particular pale green of early season, tentative, easily killed by one more hard frost. She thought about Warren Teal in Missoula, sitting in a room with federal investigators and his attorney, deciding how much to say. She thought about what it must have been like to carry that knowledge for a year, knowing what you'd done, knowing the weight of it, waiting. She didn't feel sorry for him exactly, but she understood the waiting. When she got home, Silas was splitting wood behind the barn. He looked up when she came through the gate, and she told him what Alderman had said, standing in the cold with her coat buttoned and her breath showing in the air, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, giving her the full weight of his attention. "Warren Teal," he said when she finished. "You know the name?" "I knew a Teal family from Harlan County. Don't know if it's the same." He set a piece of wood on the block. "The notary on the documents. He was right there the whole time." "Right there in the county clerk's office," Evelyn said, filing the documents he'd notarized, making them official. Silas split the wood. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "If he confirms what they think, does that end it?" "Alderman says it builds the chain, but Hargrove will fight everything. They'll challenge his credibility, claim he's lying for a deal, try to suppress whatever he gives them." She looked at the pile of split wood. "Nothing about this ends cleanly." "Nothing ever does," Silas said. He didn't say it like a complaint, just a fact that he had apparently made his peace with somewhere along the way. She went inside and called Ruth, then Gerald, then Dale Sutton. She gave each of them the same update she'd given Silas, in the same measured terms, without overselling what it meant. They had been through enough that they didn't need false comfort, and she had learned that people who have lost things often have a finely calibrated sense for when they're being handled versus when they're being told the truth. She told them the truth. Gerald said, "Do I need to do anything right now?" "Stay available," Evelyn said. "And Gerald, don't talk to anyone about the case. Not neighbors, not old friends. If someone approaches you, call me or Patricia directly." "You think they'd send someone?" "I think they're scared, and they're running out of clean moves," she said. Scared people look for the weakest point. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while, not writing on the legal pad, just sitting. The house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet in the late afternoon when the light changes. A specific golden ending-of-day quiet that Evelyn had always loved, and that had become both better and worse since Thomas died. Better because she had learned to inhabit it. Worse because inhabiting it alone still had a specific gravity to it. She made dinner. She ate without tasting it, which had been a recurring problem since the winter. The 10 days Alderman had asked for turned into 12, and those 12 days were the hardest kind. The waiting kind, where there was nothing to build and nothing to fight, just the daily work of the ranch and the county court motions Patricia was managing and the phone that sat on the kitchen table not ringing. Evelyn split the wood herself when Silas wasn't there. She cleaned the barn with a thoroughness that surprised even her. She went through Thomas's composition books again, not looking for evidence this time, just reading. The ordinary records of an ordinary life, the weather notes and cattle counts and small observations. The way he'd recorded the birth of a difficult calf with 2 lines that managed to be both factual and quietly pleased with how it had turned out. She missed him in a way that had stopped being sharp and become something more chronic, a permanent low-grade presence, like an old injury that doesn't stop you from working but reminds you it's there in the cold. On the 13th day, Alderman called. "Warren Teal gave us a full statement," he said, "with documentation." Evelyn sat down. She hadn't meant to. She'd been standing by the counter, but her legs made the decision for her. "He kept records," Alderman continued. "Emails, payment transfers, a log of every document he notarized under direction from a Hargrove subsidiary. He says he was recruited through a property management company connected to Hargrove about 9 years ago. He was paid in cash deposits to a secondary account, and he kept records of all of it as, and this is his word, insurance." "Insurance," Evelyn said. Evelyn. "He was smart enough to know that if it ever came apart, he'd need something to bargain with. He has transaction records going back 8 years, 14 properties across 5 counties, and the directives came directly from a senior officer in Hargrove's corporate structure, not through intermediaries. Richard Hargrove himself? We're not there yet, but close to the top. A pause. His full statement and documentation are being reviewed by my team. If it clears authentication, this isn't just a fraud case anymore. We're looking at organized racketeering. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was pale and bright in the midday light, the kind of light that shows every imperfection in things. The peeling paint on the barn door, the leaning post on the corral that she kept meaning to fix, the bare patches in the yard where the snow had finally given up. 14 properties, she said. 14 that we know of. There may be more. These are families who lost everything. Yes, Alderman said, and his voice had a quality to it that she hadn't heard before. Not exactly anger, but something with weight to it. They are. What happens next? We move to federal court. I'm filing to consolidate the county proceedings under federal jurisdiction, which will stop Hargrove's county motions cold while we proceed. And I want to move quickly, before they have time to adjust. He paused. I'm going to need you in court, Mrs. Mercer. Not just as a victim. I want you as a key witness. The jury needs to understand what this looked like from the ground level, and you are the person who saw all of it, from the first letter to the phone call. You built this case before I was involved. That matters. Evelyn looked at the legal pad on the table, the months of notes, the columns of dates. All right, she said. I won't pretend it's going to be comfortable, Alderman said. Their defense team will cross-examine. They'll challenge your account, your timeline, your interpretation of the documents. They'll question your mental state after your husband's death. They may try to argue you were confused or manipulated by others into seeing a conspiracy that didn't exist. Let them try, Evelyn said. A brief silence. I appreciate the confidence, Alderman said, but I want you prepared, not just willing. Patricia will work with you on testimony preparation. Take it seriously. I take everything seriously, she said. That's how we got here. She spent the next 3 weeks in preparation that was nothing like what she'd expected. She'd assumed it would be about reviewing documents and organizing timelines, which was the kind of work she already knew how to do. What she hadn't expected was how much of it was about her own story. Not the evidence, but the telling of it. Patricia worked with her for hours, sitting across the kitchen table, asking her to walk through the same sequence of events over and over, stopping her when she got ahead of herself or assumed knowledge the jury wouldn't have, slowing her down when she started speaking in the clipped, factual shorthand she'd developed after months of living with these details. They don't know Thomas, Patricia said one evening, after Evelyn had given an account of finding his notebook entry that was precise and controlled and entirely devoid of the particular quality of what it had actually felt like to read his handwriting on that page, in that September, with everything she now knew sitting on top of it. The jury needs to know who they're taking something from. Not just a property, a person and her husband, and 31 years. I'm not going to perform grief for a jury, Evelyn said. Not angry, just clear. I'm not asking you to perform anything, Patricia said. I'm asking you to stop editing it out. That landed differently. Evelyn looked at the table for a moment. Then she tried the account again, and this time she didn't skip the part where she had recognized his handwriting in the composition book, the particular way he made his capital letters, and what it had meant to see that handwriting and then look at the forged signature and understand what someone had done. She said it the way it actually was, without dressing it up or stripping it down. When she finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's it, she said. That's what the jury needs to hear. Evelyn felt vaguely exposed in a way she didn't love. It feels like too much, she said. It's the right amount, Patricia said. There's a difference. Silas drove her to the federal courthouse on the morning the trial opened. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply appeared at the door at 6:15 and said he'd drive if she wanted, and she'd said yes before she thought about whether to. He didn't try to fill the drive with reassurance or small talk. He drove. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the highway and ran through the sequence one more time in her head. Not the testimony, just the facts in order, the same way she would have run through a feed schedule or a fence inspection. Systematic, accountable to itself. The courthouse was more crowded than she'd expected. Several families she recognized: Ruth Calloway with her sister, Gerald Voss, in a jacket that looked like it had been specifically bought for this, Dale Sutton and Kim sitting close together in the gallery. There were people she didn't recognize who had the look of people who had also lost something and had heard there was somewhere to be today. She hadn't known about them. Alderman must have done more digging than she'd realized. Hargrove's defense team occupied one full side of the room, 4 attorneys, 2 of whom Evelyn recognized from court filings as senior partners of a firm based in Denver. They were impeccably organized and visibly confident, which she recognized as a professional posture rather than an accurate reading of their position. Richard Hargrove himself was there. She hadn't been certain he would be. He sat at the defense table in a dark suit and looked like a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in any room he entered and was not yet fully convinced that today would be different. He looked at her once, when she walked in, and she met his eyes and held them for a moment and then found her seat, because she had nothing to prove in a staring contest and everything to prove in the next several days. Alderman's opening statement took 40 minutes. He was methodical and precise, and he told the story the way Evelyn had come to know it, not as a collection of legal arguments, but as a sequence of events that had happened to real people who were sitting in this room. He named Gerald Voss and Ruth Calloway and Dale Sutton and the Heller family. He named Thomas Mercer, and he paused for exactly a second after he said the name, which was the right amount. He explained what Ridgeline Resource Partners was, and when it had been created, and what it had become. He laid out the pattern with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, and knew exactly when detail became overwhelming and when it became irrefutable. When he was done, the lead defense attorney stood up and delivered an opening that was technically accomplished and almost entirely beside the point. A lot of language about legitimate business, due diligence, the validity of public records, and the unreliability of people who had suffered financial losses and were looking for someone to blame. Evelyn listened to the whole thing. She noticed that the defense attorney never once looked at the gallery where the families were sitting. The first 2 days of testimony were technical. Document examiners, record specialists, Alderman's investigators walking through the chain of evidence piece by piece. Dr. Carol Winslow testified on the second afternoon and was, as Evelyn had expected, entirely unshakable. The defense attorney tried 3 different angles on cross-examination and got nothing he could use. Winslow answered every question in the same measured, precise tone and did not concede a single point she hadn't already qualified in her direct testimony. Evelyn watched the jury during the cross-examination and saw several of them stop taking notes and simply listen, which she'd been told was a good sign. Warren Teal testified on the 3rd day. Evelyn had not met him before. He was younger than she'd pictured from his name, mid-40s, with the look of a man who had been sleeping badly for about a year and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He sat in the witness box and answered Alderman's questions in a voice that was steady but without any particular confidence to it, the voice of someone who has decided to tell the truth and is not trying to sound better than what the truth makes him. He confirmed everything: the recruitment, the payments, the directives. He named the Hargrove subsidiary that had managed the operation. He identified the senior officer who had given the directives, a man named Curtis Webb, Hargrove's executive vice president, who was sitting at the defense table and whose face had been neutral for 2 days and was slightly less neutral now. He walked through 14 properties. He said the name of each one. With each name, Evelyn heard people in the gallery behind her. Small sounds. The particular sounds of recognition, of being named. The defense cross-examination of Teal lasted 4 hours and was the most aggressive thing Evelyn had seen in the courtroom. They attacked his credibility, his motive, his prior relationship with Hargrove, the terms of his cooperation agreement. They were skilled and they were relentless and they landed some real hits. Teal had accepted money, had known what he was doing was wrong, had done it anyway for 8 years. None of that was deniable, and the defense made sure the jury heard it multiple times. But Teal's documentation survived every challenge. The emails were real. The payment records were real. And the one thing the defense couldn't explain away was the consistency. 14 properties, the same method, the same structure, the same directives from the same source. You couldn't attribute that to one confused or dishonest man's misremembering. The pattern was the truth, and the pattern was in writing. Evelyn testified on the fourth day. She had been in this courthouse for 3 days before she took the stand, and she had used those 3 days to pay attention to the way the room worked, the acoustics, the rhythm of questions and answers, the way the jury moved when something landed, and the way they went still when something didn't. She was not unafraid. She was also not going to let the fear run the room. Alderman walked her through it from the beginning. The first letter, the lockbox, the composition books, Thomas's September entry in the notebook. And here she paused, not for effect, but because she needed a second, and she took it. And then she said what it had meant to recognize his handwriting and compare it to a forgery, and she said it the way Patricia had helped her learn to say it, without editing out the part that was real. She watched 2 jurors write something down. She didn't know what. She kept going. She talked about Gerald Voss in his apartment, about Ruth Calloway crying on the phone, about Darlene Marsh in the courthouse basement, pushing a ledger onto a shelf, telling her not to let them get away with it, about the note in the margin of the county ledger, C. Hargrove file, consolidated under parent entity, and what that had meant when she finally understood what she was looking at. She talked about Pruitt at her door in the dark, about Richard Hargrove's phone call at 9:30 at night, the threat about Thomas's history, the promise to make things ugly. She said those things in a flat, factual voice and did not look at Hargrove while she said them because she was not talking to him. She was talking to the 12 people in the jury box who needed to understand what this had looked like from inside it. The cross-examination started after lunch. The lead defense attorney was a man named Caldwell who was good at his job and knew it, and he came at her with a kind of polished patience that Evelyn recognized as designed to make her feel small and uncertain. He questioned her timeline, her interpretation of the notebook entry, her qualifications to assess handwriting, her relationship with Silas Boone, and whether she had been influenced in her investigation by outside parties. On the Silas question, she paused for exactly 1 second. "He fixed my fence," she said, "and then he drove me to meet Gerald Voss. He didn't tell me what to think. He just showed up when I needed a second pair of hands." She looked at Caldwell evenly. "Is that the kind of outside influence you mean?" Several jurors looked at each other. Caldwell moved on. He spent 20 minutes trying to establish that her emotional state after Thomas's death had made her susceptible to seeing a conspiracy where there was only business. Evelyn let him make the argument fully and then said, "I keep records of everything because my husband kept records of everything. The records are what they are, regardless of how I was feeling when I found them. You can look at every page." He moved on again. He tried the credibility of her witnesses. Gerald Voss's financial desperation, Ruth Calloway's grief, Dale Sutton's bitterness over a lost legal battle. Evelyn listened to all of it and then said, "Their feelings about what happened to them are real. So are the documents. Those are 2 separate things, and the documents don't change based on how the people they harmed are feeling about it." Caldwell paused. He looked at his notes. He tried 2 more angles, got nothing useful from either, and concluded the cross-examination. Alderman stood for redirect. He asked one question. "Mrs. Mercer, in everything you just described, the investigation, the county records, the witnesses you contacted, the documents you compared, did anyone tell you what to find, or did you follow the evidence where it went?" "I followed it where it went," Evelyn said. No further questions. She stepped down from the witness box and walked back to her seat, and she was aware of the gallery behind her and the weight of the room, but mostly she was aware of her own breathing, which was slower than it had been going up, and her own hands, which were not shaking. She sat down. In the gallery 2 rows back, she heard Ruth Calloway let out a long breath, the kind that's been held for a while. The defense called their witnesses over the following 2 days, corporate officers who described Hargrove's practices in terms that bore almost no relationship to what the evidence showed, a financial expert who tried to reframe the loan documents as legitimate transactions, a character witness for Curtis Webb who was, under cross-examination by aldermen, unable to explain why Webb's personal cell phone had been used in 8 of the communications Teal had documented. The defense's expert on the documents was a man who had been paid, his fee disclosed, to argue that the signatures were inconclusive rather than forged. Dr. Winslow had anticipated this and had prepared a supplemental analysis that aldermen introduced in rebuttal, which was specific and technical and thorough in a way that the defense's expert could not match. On the sixth day, closing arguments. Alderman went first and laid out the case in 45 minutes, with the kind of clarity that comes from having a structure that holds its own weight. Caldwell went second and did everything a skilled attorney could do with evidence that was running against him, which was to emphasize reasonable doubt and attack the credibility of witnesses who had interests in the outcome. Evelyn sat in the gallery and listened to Caldwell argue that Warren Teal was a self-serving, cooperating witness, that Evelyn Mercer was a grieving widow who had constructed a narrative out of coincidence and motive, that the families who had lost their land had lost it through legitimate legal processes that they had simply failed to contest effectively. She listened to all of it without showing anything on her face, which required a specific kind of effort she didn't let anyone see. Then it went to the jury. The waiting was 3 days. Evelyn went home after the first day because she had cattle to feed and a ranch to run, and she had decided early on that she was not going to become the kind of person who paced courthouse hallways. She went home and she worked, and Silas worked alongside her, and they were mostly quiet together, which was what she needed. On the second evening, Ruth Calloway drove out to the ranch unannounced, a 4-hour drive, and knocked on the door and said, "I couldn't stay in the hotel room anymore." And Evelyn said, "Come in," and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours, not about the trial, but about other things. Ruth's husband, Thomas, the particular difficulty of running a property alone, the small things that had gotten easier over time and the things that hadn't. It was the most ordinary conversation Evelyn had had in months, and it was exactly what she needed without having known she needed it. Gerald Voss called on the third morning. He'd been staying with a cousin in Billings. He said, "I don't have anything to say, I wanted to say it helped. Having someone who actually came out and sat down and looked at the paperwork. I want you to know that it helped." "I know," Evelyn said. "Even if it—" He stopped, started again. "Even if the verdict doesn't go the way we want, it still helped." She heard what he was carrying in that sentence, the weight of a man who had been through one loss already and was trying to be honest with himself about the possibility of another. She wanted to tell him it would be fine, that they had this, that the evidence was too strong. She didn't say any of that. "I know, Gerald," she said instead. "Thank you for that." She was at the kitchen table with the legal pad, not writing, just sitting with it, when Patricia called on the third afternoon. "They have a verdict." Evelyn drove to Billings alone. Silas offered, and she said no, and then she drove for 20 minutes and pulled over and called him and said, "Actually, yes." And he met her in the courthouse parking lot without comment, and they walked in together. The gallery was full, all the families. Darlene Marsh was there. Evelyn saw her in the back row and felt something move in her chest that she couldn't name exactly. Patricia was at the table. Alderman was at the table. The defense team was arranged in their careful, controlled formation, and Curtis Webb sat stiffly and Richard Hargrove sat next to him with the same posture he'd maintained for 6 days, the posture of a man who had not yet fully accepted that things could go this way. The jury filed in. Evelyn watched the 4-person stand. She had learned, somewhere in the past months, how to be very still on the outside when everything on the inside was doing something complicated and loud. She was very still now. The 4-person read the verdict, guilty on all counts, wire fraud, mail fraud, racketeering conspiracy, 14 counts of document fraud. Witness intimidation, stemming from the phone call at 9:30 on a Tuesday night in March. The one Evelyn had recorded on a phone she had kept charged every single day since the first letter arrived. The room made a sound that wasn't quite noise, a collective release, the kind that happens when people have been bracing for a long time and then don't have to anymore. Evelyn sat very still for another moment. Then she looked at the legal pad on her knee. She'd brought it, out of habit, without thinking about it. And she thought about the first entry she'd made in it, the night on the kitchen floor with the letter and the cold cups of coffee. She thought about Thomas's handwriting in the September notebook. She thought about Gerald Voss in his cinder block apartment, and Ruth crying on the phone, and Dale Sutton's jaw when he spread his documents on Kim's kitchen table. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried through most of this, which she suspected said something about her that she wasn't entirely sure was admirable. But this was also not the moment for it, because the judge was speaking, the attorneys were moving, people around her were making sounds, And there was still the sentencing to come and the civil proceedings and the question of what happened to the 14 properties and all of it still ahead. But the verdict was real. She had the legal pad. She would write it down. Patricia touched her arm. "Evelyn?" She looked up. Patricia's face was showing something that Patricia's professional training had mostly suppressed for 6 months, and it was undeniably, honestly happy. "We won," Patricia said. Evelyn nodded once. Then she said, "What about the other properties? The families who already lost theirs? What's the path for them?" Patricia blinked. Then she started to laugh, just briefly, not unkind. "The verdict is 12 minutes old," she said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm just asking." And she was. Because the verdict was the pivot point, not the finish line, and she had always been better at knowing what came next than at standing still in a moment of relief. It wasn't a flaw, exactly. It was just how she was built. Silas was standing a few feet away, giving her space, which was something she'd noticed he was good at, being present without crowding. He met her eyes when she looked over. He didn't say anything. He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded the morning she called him about the fence, the morning after the letter, when she'd asked if he could come Thursday, and he'd just said 7:30's fine. She nodded back. Around her the room was moving, people talking. Someone behind her had their arms around someone else. Ruth Calloway was sitting with both hands pressed flat on her thighs, looking at the middle distance with an expression that Evelyn recognized because she'd worn it herself more than once. The expression of someone whose whole body is catching up to something the mind has just barely accepted. 14 guilty counts, and a federal judge who, before adjourning, had ordered an immediate freeze on all Hargrove Land Corporation property transfers and asset movements pending sentencing and civil proceedings. Evelyn opened the legal pad to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote the verdict, all of it, every count, in her steady, careful hand. Then she sat and looked at what she'd written, at the column of facts that were now public record, that existed in a federal courthouse and couldn't be taken back or buried or made to disappear by a man in a dark suit who had expected her to leave before it got to this. Outside the courthouse, the Montana sky was doing what it always did in late spring. Enormous and blue and completely indifferent to human proceedings. The mountains on the western horizon were still holding their snow, but the lower slopes had gone green, the kind of green that arrives suddenly after a long time coming and looks, for a few weeks, like exactly what it is, a thing that survived. She put the pen in her coat pocket. She picked up the legal pad. She walked out of the courthouse into the cold, bright air, and the fight was not finished. There was still everything that came next. But the part that had required her to stand in a federal courtroom and make them listen had happened, and it had gone the way it went, and she had not looked away. The sentencing came 6 weeks after the verdict, and Evelyn drove to Billings for it the same way she'd driven to everything else connected to this case. Early, alone for the first hour, then with Silas for the second, because that had become the pattern without either of them formally deciding it would be. Richard Hargrove received 19 years. Curtis Webb, his executive vice president, the man whose personal cell phone had appeared in 8 of Warren Teal's documented communications, received 14. 3 other Hargrove corporate officers received sentences ranging from 4 to 8 years. The attorneys who had filed the fraudulent county documents on the corporation's behalf were referred to their state bar associations for disbarment proceedings, which Patricia explained was a separate process, but one that mattered. Warren Teal received 2 years of supervised release and a substantial fine, reduced in exchange for his cooperation. Evelyn had thought about how she felt about that on the drive over, and she had arrived at something that was not exactly satisfaction and not exactly resentment, but somewhere in the complicated territory between them. He had done wrong for 8 years and then told the truth when the weight of it became more than he could carry. That was not heroism. But it was also not nothing, and 14 families now had a verdict because of it, so she filed it under the category of things she had decided not to spend energy on. The federal judge, before closing the sentencing hearing, said something that Patricia wrote down and later read back to Evelyn. He said that the case represented one of the most systematic and calculated exploitation schemes against rural landowners that his court had encountered, and that the damage done to families whose relationship to their land went back generations was not the kind that a sentence could fully address, but that the court intended to use every available tool to come as close as possible. Then he ordered Hargrove Land Corporation dissolved as a legal entity, its remaining assets frozen pending civil restitution proceedings. Evelyn heard the word restitution and thought about Gerald Voss in his cinder-block apartment. The civil proceedings were slower, more complicated, and less dramatic than the criminal trial, which Patricia had warned her would be the case. Civil courts moved differently, and the question of what could actually be returned to families who had lost property that had since been resold or developed was genuinely complicated in ways that made Evelyn's head hurt when Patricia walked through the details. But Alderman's office had frozen the asset transfers early enough that several of the 14 properties were still technically within Hargrove's holdings, and those had the clearest path. Gerald Voss's property was one of them. Patricia called Evelyn on a Tuesday morning in early June to tell her that the civil order had come through on Gerald's parcel, that the fraudulent transfer had been formally voided, the property returned to Gerald's name, and that Gerald had been informed by Alderman's office. Evelyn said, "Did he know it was coming?" "He knew it was possible. I don't think he believed it would happen until it did." She called Gerald herself that afternoon. He picked up on the first ring, which was unusual. Gerald was the kind of man who took a while to get to his phone. "I was sitting here waiting for you to call," he said. "I figured you'd call." "How are you doing?" she said. A pause, the kind that meant he was deciding how honest to be. "I walked the property this morning," he said. I drove out and walked it. There's a lot of work to do. The fencing is a mess, and whoever Hargrove had managing it didn't take care of the soil the way it should have been." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not quite broken, not quite whole. Something in between that was probably the sound of a person trying to accommodate a reality they'd stopped believing in. "But it's there," he said. "It's still there." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. She just let him have the sentence. "I know," she said finally. Ruth Calloway's property was more complicated. It had been transferred to a development subsidiary and partially surveyed for commercial use, though no construction had started. The civil proceedings returned her land but left a survey record and a set of preliminary plans that took an additional 3 months of legal work to fully clear. Ruth moved back in December into the farmhouse she'd left 2 years earlier and called Evelyn from inside it the first night, talking for 40 minutes about the way the rooms looked different and the same, and about a crack in the kitchen ceiling that she'd always meant to repair and was inexplicably glad to see again. Dale Sutton's case was the hardest. His property had been resold by Hargrove to a third party who had purchased it without knowledge of the fraud, an innocent buyer whose interests the court also had to account for. The civil process took nearly 8 months and resulted in a settlement that returned a portion of the land and compensated Dale for the remainder at assessed value. It was not everything. Patricia told him that honestly, and Dale sat with it for a few days and then said, "I'm not going to pretend it's everything, but I can work with a portion." Kim, who had sat in waiting rooms and driven her father to federal buildings and kept his documents in a shoebox under her bed, cried when she heard the settlement terms, not from grief, but from the specific exhaustion of a person who has been bracing for the worst for so long that any outcome short of total loss feels like more than they knew how to hope for. The Heller family got their land back in full. There were 14 properties in Teal's documentation, and the outcomes varied. Some returned entirely, some partially compensated, 2 involving third-party complications that extended the proceedings well into the following year. Not one family got exactly what they'd lost, because you cannot fully restore what time has taken from a life lived on a piece of land. But all of them got something, and for most of them the something was enough to start again. Evelyn's own property, 441 Two Copper Ridge Road, 160 acres of rocky high country Montana terrain with a farmhouse that needed a new roof and a barn that listed slightly left and 22 head of cattle that had become 31 over the course of a long and complicated year, was formally cleared of all claims in May, 2 weeks before the sentencing. The federal judge signed a permanent protection order against any future Hargrove-affiliated entity attempting to assert interest in the property. Patricia framed the order and brought it out to the ranch herself, which was not something attorneys typically did, and set it on the kitchen table and said, "Put this somewhere safe. Evelyn put it in the lockbox, next to Thomas's deed. She stood in the bedroom with the lockbox open for a moment before she closed it, looking at the deed in Thomas's handwriting from 31 years ago. The date, the legal description of the land, his signature at the bottom. The real one, the actual one, the one that looked like him in every particular. She looked at it for a while, and then she closed the box and put it back in the closet and went downstairs to make dinner. The roof got fixed in July. Silas organized it, not without asking, which she would not have accepted, but by mentioning one morning that he knew a crew that did good work at a fair price and asking if she wanted him to get an estimate, and she said yes. The crew came on a Thursday and finished by Saturday, and the new shingles were a slightly different shade than the old ones, which bothered Evelyn in a small, persistent way that she decided was fine. The roof worked. The shade would weather. The fence line along the south pasture, which had been in chronic disrepair since the previous owner before Thomas, got rebuilt properly that August. New posts, new wire, the corner bracing done the way it should have been done 20 years ago. Silas did most of it, and Evelyn worked alongside him, and they were both sore by the end of each day, in the way that real physical work makes you sore, the useful kind that means something got done. She had been thinking for several weeks about something she wanted to say to him and hadn't found the right moment for, partly because she was not naturally a person who said things like it, and partly because she wasn't entirely sure how to say it without it sounding like either too much or not enough. She said it on the second evening of the fence work, sitting on the tailgate of his truck eating sandwiches because neither of them had thought to bring actual plates. "I don't know what this would have looked like without you," she said, not looking at him, looking at the fence line. "I want you to know I know that." He was quiet for a moment. "You would have found a way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to because you showed up." She paused. "I'm not good at saying thank you. I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her then, the way he sometimes did, direct, without any particular agenda, just looking. "You never needed saving," he said. "You needed somebody to hold the other end." She thought about that. It was exactly right, which was something he occasionally was, and she had stopped being surprised by it. "Yeah," she said. "That's exactly it." They ate their sandwiches. The evening light was doing what it did in August in Montana, going gold and long across the grass, the mountains catching it on their western faces, the whole landscape settling into something that looked, for an hour each day, like an argument for staying exactly where you were. She had been thinking about Thomas less in the sharp way and more in the steady way, not because he was fading, but because she had stopped fighting the grief and let it become part of the landscape of her life, the way old losses do when you stop trying to resolve them and just let them be there. He was in the composition books on the shelf in the spare bedroom. He was in the deed in the lockbox. He was in the September notebook entry. Had to be firm. And in every fence post that had been set right because she'd refused to let anyone take what he had spent his life building. She didn't feel his absence as a wound anymore. She felt it as a fact, the way you feel the shape of a room you've lived in long enough to know in the dark. That was something. It had taken more than a year to get there, and the road had not been what she would have chosen, but she was there. In September, a few weeks after the fence was done, Patricia called to say that Alderman's office had received inquiries from 2 other counties in the region, unrelated to the Hargrove case, where similar patterns of fraudulent loan documents targeting recently widowed or elderly landowners had been identified, and that Alderman was asking whether Evelyn would be willing to speak with investigators working those cases. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when the call came. The legal pad was in front of her. A new one, not the original. The original was in the drawer under the lockbox, full from the first entry to the last page, a record of everything. "Yes," she said. "Tell him yes." Patricia paused. "Evelyn, you've been through a year of this. It's all right to say you need time before taking on something new." "I know it's all right," Evelyn said. I'm saying yes anyway." There was a beat of silence that felt like Patricia deciding whether to argue, and then not. "I'll let him know," she said. The first family from the adjacent county came to the Mercer Ranch on a Saturday in October. A woman named Barbara Holt, in her late 60s, who had lost her husband the previous winter and was 6 weeks into receiving letters from a company she'd never heard of, claiming her property was collateral on a loan her husband had taken out. She drove 2 hours and knocked on the door and stood on the porch with a manila folder in her hands and an expression Evelyn recognized from the inside. The look of a person who has been told something is happening to them and cannot yet believe it is actually happening. "Come in," Evelyn said. "I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table. Evelyn listened. Then she said, "Show me the documents." Barbara spread them on the table. Evelyn looked at them for a while. Same notary format, different name, a different operation, probably unrelated to Hargrove, but the same method. Someone had identified something that worked and was using it again somewhere else. "The signature," Evelyn said. "Do you have something with your husband's actual handwriting? Letters, notes, anything?" Barbara looked in the folder. She pulled out a birthday card. The kind men buy when they mean something but don't quite know how to say it. A few words inside in an unsteady hand. She set it on the table next to the loan document. Evelyn looked at both of them. "That's not his handwriting," she said. Barbara's face did something complicated. "No," she said quietly. "It's not." "All right," Evelyn said. She pulled the legal pad toward her. "Let's start at the beginning. Tell me everything, in order, and I'll write it down." Barbara looked at the legal pad. Then she looked at Evelyn. This woman she had driven 2 hours to find, who had won a federal case with a telephone and a notebook and a refusal to stop, who was sitting at her kitchen table in a house that someone had tried to take and failed, offering her exactly what nobody had offered Barbara Holt or Gerald Voss or Ruth Calloway in the beginning, someone who would sit down and actually listen. "Okay," Barbara said. She straightened in her chair. "Okay." Evelyn wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, the way she always did. It was a cold October morning, and the sky outside was the deep, serious blue that Montana got in autumn, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, and somewhere behind the barn, Silas was doing something with the equipment shed that had needed attention since August. The house smelled like coffee and old wood, and the particular combination of things that makes a place feel lived in rather than just occupied. Evelyn had not set out to become the person that people drove 2 hours to find. She had set out to keep her ranch. She had set out to not be taken from. Those were the only intentions she'd started with. In the kitchen on the floor with the first letter in January, 2 cups of coffee going cold. What she had become in the process of doing that was something she hadn't planned and couldn't have anticipated. The person who knew how this worked, who had walked through it and come out the other side with documents and a verdict and a full legal pad, who understood from the inside what it cost and what it required and what the possibilities were. She hadn't chosen that role, but she was in it, and she was not the kind of person who left a room half-painted. She thought sometimes about what Thomas would have made of all of it. He had been a quieter man than she was a woman, more patient, less inclined to confrontation, the kind of person who would rather fix a thing than argue about it. But he had also been the man who wrote, had to be firm in his notebook and meant it, who kept 31 years of records because he understood that the truth needed to be legible, who had told them no in September and told them no again and would have kept telling them no because the land was not a financial instrument to him. It was the shape of his life. She thought he would have understood what she'd done with the legal pad. She thought he might have been quietly, genuinely proud in the way he showed pride, not with speeches, but with a kind of increased stillness, the way he'd settle into a chair when something went right and just be there with it. That was enough for her. It was more than enough. Gerald Voss called in November to say he'd gotten 3 head of cattle back on the property and the east fence was holding. He sounded different than he had in his apartment in Ridgemont. Not fully recovered, because that was not how recovery worked, and they both knew it, but inhabited again. Present in a way he hadn't been, like a man who had relearned what it meant to have somewhere to be in the morning. Ruth Calloway called to say the crack in her kitchen ceiling was still there, and she had decided to leave it. "I keep looking at it," she said, "and I keep thinking about all the time I spent away from this house, and the crack was here the whole time, and the house was here the whole time, just waiting." She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that exactly, but I'm glad to be back under it." Dale Sutton and Kim drove out in December with a casserole and a bottle of wine and stayed for 3 hours, which was the longest Evelyn had been in a room with more than 2 other people since the trial. Kim talked about her job and her kids and a trip she'd taken to Portland, And Dale talked about what he was going to do with the portion of land the settlement had returned, the specific plans, the specific fields, and Evelyn listened and ate the casserole and thought about what it meant that these people were sitting at her table in a house that still had all of its roof and all of its fence and its 160 acres intact. It meant something she did not have a word for, not triumph. That was too clean, too resolved. Not relief, that was still too narrow. Something more like the feeling of a structure that has been tested from every direction and is still standing, not because it was perfect, but because it was built on something real and the people inside it had refused to leave. Silas stayed through the winter. He didn't move in. That wasn't what this was, or not yet, and Evelyn was not a person who rushed the shape of things. But he was there most days, working, and most evenings he was in the kitchen for a while before going back to wherever he was staying, and that arrangement had a naturalness to it that she had stopped questioning. He had his own silences and his own distances, things he didn't talk about that she had learned not to push on, because she had her own. They were two people with significant amounts of their own history who had found, somewhere in the middle of one of the hardest years of Evelyn's life, that they were better in a room together than apart. That was not a small thing. She had lived long enough to know it was not a small thing. One evening in January, she was going through the spare bedroom, reorganizing the composition books, putting them in proper order on the shelf, which she'd been meaning to do for months, when she found the one from the year she and Thomas had bought the ranch. 1992, the cover worn at the corners, the spine repaired once with electrical tape in a way that had always slightly embarrassed Thomas because he'd done it badly. She sat on the floor and opened it. His handwriting from 30 years ago was the same and somehow younger, the same hand, but with less certainty in the letter forms, a little less settled. They had been nervous that year. New mortgage, new land, new life, neither of them entirely sure they knew what they were doing. Thomas had written about it in his careful, factual way. The cost of the first load of hay, the condition of the fences when they arrived, the fact that the well pump worked but sounded wrong. And then, near the back of the notebook, an entry from the 1st December, cold today. Evelyn fixed the water line herself, wouldn't wait for me to get back from town. Fence on the north end needs work in spring, but the land is good. We made the right call. She sat with that on the floor of the spare bedroom for a while. The land is good. We made the right call. 32 years ago. A different person writing it in some ways, though the handwriting was the same. A younger man who didn't know yet what the land would ask of them, what it would take and what it would give back, what would happen in 31 years and 1 year and all the months in between. He had been right. They had made the right call. She put the notebook back on the shelf in order with the others. She turned off the light in the spare bedroom and went downstairs to where the kitchen was warm and Silas was reading something at the table, his reading glasses on, which was a recent development she had not commented on because she knew better than to comment on the small dignities. He looked up when she came in. "Find what you were looking for?" he said. "Not looking for anything," she said. "Just putting things in order." She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the kitchen, the table with its worn finish, the window over the sink with the dark beyond it, the hook by the door where her coat hung next to his. The legal pad was on the counter, the new one, the one with Barbara Holt's account started on the first page and more pages to fill. There was always more to do. There was always the next thing, the next family, the next fight, the next fence line that needed attention. She was not someone who rested easily, and she had stopped expecting herself to be. The restlessness was part of her, and she had learned to point it somewhere useful rather than resent it. But she also knew, and this was something the past year had given her, hard and real and permanent, that the doing was not the whole of it, that you could work yourself to nothing chasing the next thing and miss the fact that the thing you were protecting was right here, that the ranch was not only the work it took to keep it, that the people at the kitchen table were not only the function they served. Thomas had known that. He'd written it down in December of 1992 on a cold day when the land was new and everything was uncertain. The land is good. Not the cattle count, not the fence condition, not the profit margin. The land is good. She was still here. The land was still good. "You want tea?" she said to Silas. He looked up from his book. "Sure," he said. She put the kettle on. Outside, the January wind was doing what it did, pushing against the walls of the house, looking for the gaps, finding fewer than it used to. The cattle were in for the night. The fences were straight. The lockbox in the bedroom closet held a deed and a federal protection order, both of them real, both of them hers. The kettle began to heat. Silas turned a page. The legal pad sat on the counter with Barbara Holt's story on the first page, waiting for whatever came next. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, in her house on her land, and felt the ordinary, impermanent, stubbornly real weight of a life that had been fought for and was still standing. Not because it was perfect, not because the grief was gone, or the work was done, or the world had decided to be fair, because she had not left, because the people who came to take it had underestimated what it meant to her, and she had let them, and then she had shown them the difference. That was the whole of it. That was what it had come down to, in the end. Not a legal strategy or a courtroom or 14 counts of fraud, but a woman who had sat on her kitchen floor with a letter that was meant to break her and had decided, quietly and permanently, that she was not going to be broken. The kettle boiled. She poured the tea.